This is Audible.
The Battle of Yellow Tavern, the history of the Civil War battle that ended J.E.B. Stuart's life. Written by Charles River editors. Narrated by Michael Gilbo. Introduction. Quote, "He told me he never expected to live through the war, and that if we were conquered, that he did not want to live." End quote. Major Andrew R. Venable, Stuart's aide. Alongside Robert E. Lee, no one epitomized the chivalry and heroism celebrated by the Lost Cause more than J.E.B. Stuart, the most famous cavalry officer of the Civil War. Stuart was equal parts great and grandiose while leading the cavalry for the Confederacy in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Stuart was a throwback to the past, colorfully dressing with capes, sashes, and an ostrich plumed hat, while sporting cologne and a heavy beard. But he was also brilliant in conducting reconnaissance, and he proved capable of leading both cavalry and infantry at battles like Chancellorsville. As the eyes and ears of Robert E. Lee's army, none were better, despite the fact that he was only in his late 20s and early 30s during the Civil War, far younger than most men of senior rank. In early May of 1864, Union cavalry commander Philip Sheridan organized a massive raid against Confederate supply and railroad lines near Richmond. On May 9th, the largest cavalry force ever assembled in the Eastern Theater, over 10,000 horsemen and 32 artillery pieces, arched southeast, intending to slip behind Lee's army and head toward Richmond. By doing so, they could harness supply lines, cut up railroad tracks behind Lee's army, and at least feint towards Richmond in a way that would bring about a confrontation. This would give Sheridan the chance to seek his biggest objective: eliminate Stuart's cavalry. Moving aggressively, Sheridan crossed the North Anna River and seized Beaver Dam Station on the Virginia Central Railroad. Anticipating their arrival, Stuart and his cavalrymen had already destroyed most of the critical military supplies, so Sheridan's men destroyed railroad cars, ripped out telegraph lines, and rescued hundreds of Union prisoners of war who had been captured at the Battle of the Wilderness days earlier. Around noon on May 11, 1864, the two forces met at Yellow Tavern, an abandoned inn 6 miles north of Richmond, Virginia. Not only did the Union outnumber the Confederates, it had superior firepower because many of the horsemen were armed with newly developed rapid-firing Spencer carbine rifles. Despite the disadvantages, however, the Confederates proved resilient for several hours as both sides conducted charges and countercharges, but during one of them, Stuart came into view of some retreating Union soldiers of George Custer's 5th Michigan Cavalry. One of them, a 48-year-old sharpshooter named John A. Huff, found himself only about 20 yards away from the vaunted and easily recognizable Stuart. Huff turned and shot Stuart with his .44 caliber pistol, sending a bullet slicing through his stomach and exiting his back, just right of his spine. In excruciating pain, an ambulance took Stuart to the home of his brother-in-law, Dr. Charles Brewer, in Richmond, to await his wife's arrival. But before his wife could even reach him, Stuart died the following day at 7:38 p.m. In his final moments, Stuart ordered his sword and spurs be given to his son, and his last words were, "I am resigned. God's will be done." He was just 31. Chapter 1. The Start of the Overland Campaign. Failing to secure the capture of any major northern cities, or the recognition of Great Britain or France, or the complete destruction of any northern armies, the Confederacy's last chance to survive the Civil War was the election of 1864. Democrats had been pushing an anti-war stance, or at least a stance calling for a negotiated peace, for years, so the South hoped that if a Democrat defeated President Lincoln, or if anti-war Democrats could retake Congress, the North might negotiate peace with the South. In the election of 1862, anti-war Democrats made some gains in Congress and won the governorship of the state of New York. Confederates were therefore hopeful that trend would continue to the election of 1864. Although the Army of the Potomac had been victorious at Gettysburg, Lincoln was still upset at what he perceived to be General George Meade's failure to trap Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in Pennsylvania. When Lee retreated from Pennsylvania without much fight from the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln was again discouraged, believing Meade had a chance to end the war if he had been bolder. Though historians dispute that, and the Confederates actually invited attack during their retreat, Lincoln was constantly looking for more aggressive fighters to lead his men. Lincoln's appreciation for aggressive fighters had made him a defender of Ulysses S. Grant as far back as 1862. In April 1862, Grant's army had won the biggest battle in the history of North America to date, at Shiloh, with nearly 24,000 combined casualties among the Union and Confederate forces. Usually the winner of a major battle is hailed as a hero, but Grant was hardly a winner at Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh took place before costlier battles at places like Antietam and Gettysburg, so the extent of the casualties at Shiloh shocked the nation. Moreover, at Shiloh the casualties were viewed as needless. Grant was pilloried for allowing the Confederates to take his forces by surprise, as well as the failure to build defensive earthworks and fortifications, which nearly resulted in a rout of his army. Speculation again arose that Grant had a drinking problem, and some even assumed he was drunk during the battle. Though the Union won, it was largely viewed that their success owed to the heroics of General William Tecumseh Sherman in rallying the men and Don Carlos Buell arriving with his army, and General Buell was happy to receive the credit at Grant's expense. Lincoln's steadfastness ensured that Grant's victories out west continued to pile up, and after Vicksburg and Chattanooga, Grant had effectively ensured Union control of the states of Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as the entire Mississippi River. Thus, at the beginning of 1864, Lincoln put him in charge of all Federal armies, a position that required Grant to come east. Grant had already succeeded in achieving two of President Lincoln's three primary directives for a Union victory: the opening of the Mississippi Valley Basin and the domination of the corridor from Nashville to Atlanta. If he could now seize Richmond, he would achieve the third. Before beginning the overland campaign against Lee's army, Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln devised a new strategy that would eventually implement total war tactics. Grant aimed to use the Army of the Potomac to attack Lee and/or take Richmond. Meanwhile, General Sherman, now in command of the Department of the West, would attempt to take Atlanta and strike through Georgia. In essence, having already cut the Confederacy in half with Vicksburg campaign, he now intended to bisect the eastern half. On top of all that, Grant and Sherman were now intent on fully depriving the Confederacy of the ability to keep fighting. Sherman put this policy in effect during his march to the sea by confiscating civilian resources and literally taking the fight to the Southern people. For Grant, it meant a war of attrition that would steadily bleed Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. To take full advantage of the North's manpower, in 1864, the Union also ended prisoner exchanges to ensure that the Confederate armies could not be bolstered by paroled prisoners. By 1864, things were looking so bleak for the South that the Confederate war strategy was simply to ensure Lincoln lost re-election that November, with the hope that a new Democratic president would end the war and recognize the South's independence. With that, and given the shortage in manpower, Lee's strategic objective was to continue defending Richmond, while hoping that Grant would commit some blunder that would allow him a chance to seize an opportunity. With that, the stage was set for the two most successful generals of the Civil War to finally face each other. Confederate Brigadier General John B. Gordon, whose brigade would play a crucial role at the Battle of the Wilderness, aptly summarized the situation entering May 1864. Quote, Grant had come from his campaigns in the Southwest with the laurels of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Missionary Ridge on his brow. Lee stood before him with a record as military executioner unrivaled by that of any warrior of modern times. He had, at astoundingly short intervals and with unvarying regularity, decapitated or caused the official taking off of the 5 previously selected commanders-in-chief of the great army which confronted him. This advance by General Grant inaugurated the 7th act in the On to Richmond drama played by the armies of the Union. As usual, the Army of the Potomac had a large numbers advantage over Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, with Grant bringing an estimated 100,000 into the Wilderness to face Lee's 60,000. Although George Meade was nominally in command of the Union Army, the fact that Grant marched with the army essentially meant that he would be making the overall decisions. The Army of the Potomac was organized into 3 infantry corps. John Sedgwick's V-1 Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock's II Corps, and Governor Warren's V Corps, along with a cavalry corps led by Phil Sheridan, who Grant brought east with him. Until 1864, Sheridan had been an infantry leader, and his reluctance to engage in traditional cavalry operations would play a large role in bringing about the Battle of Yellow Tavern. The Army of Northern Virginia started the overland campaign with the same structure as it had after losing Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville in May 1863. Lee's army was also divided into 3 corps commanded by James Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and Richard S. Ewell. Longstreet was perhaps the best corps commander on either side during the Civil War, but Hill and Ewell struggled leading their corps at Gettysburg after having distinguished themselves in charge of smaller commands earlier in the war. The Confederate cavalry was led by their flamboyant but skilled cavalier, J.E.B. Stuart, who was as competent as he was vainglorious. When Grant began marching the army on May 4th, he actually hoped to avoid a general battle against Lee in the Wilderness, given that the heavy forestry and thick underbrush would make infantry coordination impossible and artillery practically unusable. To avoid fighting on this ground, Grant needed to move the army southeast as quickly as he could, and he hoped to reach Spotsylvania Courthouse before fighting Lee. As it turned out, Grant would fight Lee at Spotsylvania Courthouse, but it would be the second pitched battle of the campaign. The sheer size of the army made it difficult to move everything, especially its supplies. Grant's army was marching with just 10 days of rations, so a lot of live cattle had to be brought along to be butchered along the way, not to mention the thousands of wagons and ambulances as well. By some counts, the rear of the marching army would have extended over 60 miles if marching down a single road. Lee didn't oppose Grant's crossings because he had dispersed his army to prepare for several avenues of attack that Grant might choose. In fact, he anticipated that Grant would cross exactly how he did, using the Germanna and Ely fords across the Rapidan River. But he hadn't concentrated his army until he knew for sure. As a result, Ewell's corps and Hill's corps were within marching distance of the Wilderness, but Longstreet was about 20 miles southwest near Gordonsville. Grant's march intended to turn Lee's right flank, but once Lee realized which way Grant was marching on May 4, he began swiftly moving to meet the Union Army in the Wilderness, since it was ideal for defense and negated the artillery advantage enjoyed by the Army of the Potomac. And as a result of the manner in which Grant's army was marching down separate roads, Lee was being given a chance to strike the Union's right flank instead of vice versa. Ewell's corps and Hill's corps were close enough to fight in the Wilderness, but it would take a day for Longstreet's corps to come up. Lee's intentions were assisted by the nature of the terrain, which allowed his 2 corps to march almost entirely undetected, as well as the Union's misuse of their cavalry. While cavalry was typically used to screen the infantry's advance and to conduct reconnaissance, Sheridan's cavalry was east of the army responding to a report that J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry was near Fredericksburg, presumably with the intention of harassing the Union Army's rear. The only problem was that the report was completely inaccurate. Stuart was actually southeast near Spotsylvania, where his cavalry would be in position to ride north and intercept Warren's advancing V Corps. Although Grant did not realize that Lee's army was closing in on his, he did have the wherewithal to face his army west when it wasn't marching south, aware that if an attack did come, it would come from that direction. Indeed, it wouldn't take long for the armies to run into each other on May 5th. Chapter 2. The Battle of the Wilderness. As Warren's column started marching south around dawn on the 5th, it ran into Ewell's corps heading east on the Orange Turnpike toward him around 6 a.m. Shortly after that, Union cavalry reported Confederate infantry, Hill's corps, marching in force east down the Orange Plank Road. In response, Grant immediately scrambled to form a battle line on both of Warren's flanks while preparing to attack whatever force was in his front. But with Hancock's II Corps too far away, Grant had to order up one of the divisions in Sedgwick's corps to advance and join Warren's left flank, while the rest of the V-1 Corps formed on Warren's right flank. Grant's aide, Theodore Lyman, would later describe just how difficult the Wilderness was to maneuver around near the Orange Plank Road. Quote, The very worst of it is parallel with Orange Plank and upper part of the Brock Road. Here it is mostly a low, continuous, thick growth of small saplings, 15 to 30 feet high, and seldom larger than one's arm. The half-grown leaves added to the natural obscurity, and there were many places where a line of troops could with difficulty be seen at 50 yards. This was the terrain on which we were called to maneuver a great army." End quote. When the fighting ended on May 5th, both lines had maintained their respective positions, and the soldiers on both sides immediately started digging in and preparing strong defensive fortifications. There was still a gap separating the two armies from completely forming one line, something Grant would attempt to remedy the next day by bringing up Burnside's 9 Corps, and something that Lee could do nothing about other than to gamble that the confusing wilderness would protect Hill's left flank and Ewell's right flank. Despite being outnumbered and not gaining any ground, Lee had kept Grant's army in the wilderness, and he could count on Longstreet arriving at some point to fight tomorrow. Lee reported back to Richmond, quote, "The enemy crossed the Rapidan yesterday at Ely's and Germanna Fords. 2 corps of this army moved to oppose him, Ewell's by the old turnpike, and Hill's by the plank road. They arrived this morning in close proximity to the enemy's line of march. A strong attack was made upon Ewell, who repulsed it, capturing many prisoners and 4 pieces of artillery. The enemy subsequently concentrated upon General Hill, who, with Heth and Wilcox's divisions, successfully resisted repeated and desperate assaults. A large force of cavalry and artillery on our right flank was driven back by Rosser's brigade. By the blessing of God, we maintained our position against every effort until night, when the contest closed." End quote. At the beginning of May 6th, Grant was hoping that his advantage in manpower would make it possible for Burnside's 9 Corps to interpose itself between Hill and Ewell, making it possible to cut Lee's army in half and destroy them. But he wasn't the only one intending to make an attack. The characteristically aggressive Lee had decided to keep Hill's outnumbered men in position, and even use them to attack Hancock's corps, operating under the assumption that Longstreet's corps would be up in the morning and could sustain the momentum of the advance. Naturally, things would not go according to plan for either Grant or Lee. Due to miscommunications, or due to the understanding that they would be used to attack the following morning, multiple divisions in Hill's corps decided not to dig in and build defensive fortifications on the night of May 5th. While that may have been understandable and normal in 1862, experience had taught both sides by 1864 that the first thing to do once they had an established line was to start digging in and building earthworks that would protect them during an attack. By the end of the war, the Civil War had become a forerunner to the trench warfare of World War I, and if an army was given 24 hours to entrench, their position became practically unassailable. Moreover, Lee had expected that Longstreet's men would be up at dawn, allowing him to slide Hill's corps to the left and eventually link up with Ewell, which would have put Hill in the gap that Grant intended to push Burnside's 9 Corps through. However, the nature of the night marching, the nature of the roads, and the nature of the terrain all delayed Longstreet's marching during the early morning hours of May the 6th. Longstreet's late arrival meant Lee could not slide Hill's corps to the left, but it meant that his corps was in just the right place to stop Hancock's assault and launch a fierce counterattack itself. As Longstreet's column came marching up, Lee was so excited that he began riding at the head of the column, acting as though he intended to lead the counterattack himself. Writing about the episode decades later, Longstreet quipped that if Lee was going to lead the charge, he'd like to move farther behind the lines to safety. Hancock's defensive line ultimately held because of the defensive fortifications his men had constructed the night before. Although the Confederates were able to get into their rifle pits, the 2 Corps eventually repulsed them, forcing Lee to take time to reform his lines and prepare another attack for later in the afternoon. Chapter 3. The campaign continues. On May 7th, with the two armies in the same line staring each other down, Grant issued marching orders to his army, beginning the process of delicately pulling out his defensive lines in the face of Lee's army. The 2 days had produced nearly 30,000 casualties, with over 17,000 Union soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and over 11,000 Confederates suffering the same fate. The battle was over, but who had won it? Grant would later call the Battle of the Wilderness a Union victory, writing, quote, "Our victory consisted in having successfully crossed a formidable stream, almost in the face of an enemy, and in getting the army together as a unit. We gained an advantage on the morning of the 6th, which, if it had been followed up, must have proven very decisive. In the evening the enemy gained an advantage, but was speedily repulsed. As we stood at the close, the two armies were relatively in about the same condition to meet each other as when the river divided them. But the fact of having safely crossed was a victory." End quote. Naturally, Lee saw it from a different perspective, telling Richmond at the end of May 6th, quote, "Early this morning, as the divisions of General Hill, engaged yesterday, were being relieved, the enemy advanced and created some confusion. The ground lost was recovered as soon as the fresh troops got into position and the enemy driven back to his original line. Afterward, we turned the left of his front line and drove it from the field, leaving a large number of dead and wounded in our hands, among them General Wadsworth. A subsequent attack forced the enemy into his entrenched lines on the Brock Road, extending from Wilderness Tavern on the right to Triggs Mill. Every advance on his part, thanks to a merciful God, has been repulsed. Our loss in killed is not large, but we have many wounded, most of them slightly, artillery being little used on either side. I grieve to announce that Lieutenant General Longstreet was severely wounded and General Jenkins killed. General Pegram was badly wounded yesterday. General Stafford, it is hoped, will recover." End quote. Both sides claimed victory, but who was right? In a sense, they were both right and wrong. For the third straight year, Lee's army had successfully defended an advance toward Richmond by the Army of the Potomac, and inflicted more casualties upon them. Moreover, it would be Grant who disengaged from the battle and left the field to Lee. But while these suggest the Confederates had won a tactical victory, the Battle of the Wilderness would not be a strategic victory because it would not end Grant's campaign. Although Grant had suffered more casualties, he and Lee had both lost about 17% of their armies. This worked in Grant's favor, not only because his army remained much larger than Lee's, but also because he could replenish his manpower much more easily. While the casualties would astound and mortify the American public, it was all part of Grant's plan to grind down the Army of Northern Virginia until it could put up no resistance. This was evident to Lee, who became increasingly more desperate to score some kind of dramatic victory that would destroy the Army of the Potomac later in the Overland Campaign. Unlike McClellan, Burnside, and Hooker before him, Grant's orders directed the Army of the Potomac to continue heading south. The Battle of the Wilderness had only been a beginning, not an ending, as Grant would famously telegraph Washington, D.C. a few days later. Quote, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." End quote. With that, Grant began marching his army toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, the area he had hoped to reach before fighting Lee in a pitched battle. Things hadn't gone according to plan in the Wilderness, but Grant and Lee would have their battle at Spotsylvania soon enough. Moreover, that decision would bring about the Battle of Yellow Tavern. Chapter 4. Cavalry Operations After the Wilderness. When Grant ordered Meade on the night of May 7th to have the Army of the Potomac march to Spotsylvania Courthouse, he did so for several reasons. In addition to disengaging from Lee at the Wilderness and trying to bring him out into the open, Grant hoped that swift marching might get his army between Lee and Richmond, which would make the Confederates even more desperate. Grant's route to Spotsylvania Courthouse had been opened by Sheridan's cavalry in the days before, due mostly to the fact that Grant had initially intended to march there before engaging in battle. Sheridan's cavalry had been holding important spots, including crossings of the Nye and Po rivers, in anticipation of that movement, but when Hancock's left was turned by Longstreet's corps on May 6th, the cavalry had been hurried back north. As a result, when Grant issued the orders to march toward Spotsylvania on May 7th, it was once again incumbent on the Union cavalry to ride to those spots and hold them for the infantry advance. Sheridan explained in his memoirs, quote, "On the 7th day of May, under directions from headquarters, Army of the Potomac, the trains were put in motion to go into park at Piney Branch Church, in anticipation of the movement that was about to be made for the possession of Spotsylvania Courthouse. I felt confident that the order to move the trains there had been given without a full understanding of the situation, for Piney Branch Church was now held by the enemy, a condition which had resulted from the order withdrawing the cavalry on account of the supposed disaster to Hancock's left the day before. But I thought the best way to remedy matters was to hold the trains in the vicinity of Aldrich's till the ground on which it was intended to park them should be regained. This led to the Battle of Todd's Tavern, a spirited fight for the possession of the crossroads at that point, participated in by the enemy's cavalry and Gregg's division, and 2 brigades of Torbert's division, the latter commanded by Merritt, as Torbert became very ill on the 6th and had to be sent to the rear. To gain the objective point, the crossroads, I directed Gregg to assail the enemy on the Carthapin Road with Irvin Gregg's brigade and drive him over Corbin's Bridge, while Merritt attacked him with the reserve brigade on the Spotsylvania Road in conjunction with Davies' brigade of Gregg's division, which was to be put in on the Piney Branch Church Road and unite with Merritt's left. Davies and Irvin Gregg's brigades on my right and left flanks met with some resistance, yet not enough to deter them from executing their orders. In front of Merritt, the enemy held on more stubbornly, however, and there ensued an exceedingly severe and, at times, fluctuating fight. Finally, the Confederates gave way, and we pursued them almost to Spotsylvania Court House. But, deeming it prudent to recall the pursuers about dark, I encamped Gregg's and Merritt's divisions in the open fields to the east of Todd's Tavern. End quote. As noted by Grant in his memoirs, the Confederates were not idle on May 7th. The movements of the Union Army's logistics train had suggested to Lee that Grant was either moving east toward Fredericksburg or south toward Spotsylvania. Either way, Lee needed to hold the crossroads at Spotsylvania, so he gave orders to Richard Anderson's corps to occupy Spotsylvania Court House on May 8th. Luckily for the Confederates, however, the desperate fighting of the 6th by that corps had sparked fires in the area of the fighting, and the putrid smells of the burning and death compelled Anderson and his soldiers to go ahead and march to Spotsylvania that night, rather than try to bivouac near the burning and dying. Thus, by 10 p.m., Anderson's corps was already on the march toward Spotsylvania. The same fires that had compelled the Confederates to march that night were also causing logistical problems for the Army of the Potomac's movement. In addition to the inevitable traffic jams on the roads, the Union's unfamiliarity with the area caused fits and starts. While the infantry struggled to get underway in the right direction, the poor relationship between Meade and Sheridan played an important role on the night of the 7th. After Sheridan's cavalry had taken up their posts to hold the necessary ground for the infantry, Meade lost his temper when he and Grant arrived near Todd's Tavern and found Sheridan's cavalry troopers sleeping near their posts. At that point, Meade ordered part of Sheridan's cavalry to help clear the road for the infantry's march, which incensed Sheridan. Sheridan later claimed that this decision prevented his cavalry from blocking the Confederates at Spotsylvania, writing, quote, "Had Gregg and Merritt been permitted to proceed as they were originally instructed, it is doubtful whether the battles fought at Spotsylvania would have occurred, for these 2 divisions would have encountered the enemy at the Po River, and so delayed his march as to enable our infantry to reach Spotsylvania first, and thus force Lee to take up a line behind the Po. I had directed Wilson to move from the left by the gate through Spotsylvania to Snell's Bridge, while Gregg and Merritt were to advance to the same point by Shady Grove and the Block House. There was nothing to prevent at least a partial success of these operations. That is to say, the concentration of the 3 divisions in front of Snell's Bridge, even if we could not have actually gained it. But both that important point and the bridge on the Blockhouse Road were utterly ignored, and Lee's approach to Spotsylvania left entirely unobstructed, while 3 divisions of cavalry remained practically ineffective by reason of disjointed and irregular instructions. On the morning of the 8th, when I found that such orders had been given, I made some strong remonstrances against the course that had been pursued, but it was then too late to carry out the combinations I had projected the night before, so I proceeded to join Merritt on the Spotsylvania road. On reaching Merritt, I found General Warren making complaint that the cavalry were obstructing his column, so I drew Merritt off the road, and the leading division of the 5th Corps pushed up to the front. It got into line about 11 o'clock and advanced to take the village, but it did not go very far before it struck Anderson's corps and was hurled back with heavy loss. This ended all endeavor to take Spotsylvania that day." End quote. As Sheridan's account indicates, Anderson's corps eventually forced the advanced elements of his cavalry to fall back up the road. At the same time, it's unclear whether Sheridan's 2 divisions of cavalry could have held off an entire Confederate corps of infantry long enough for Warren's V Corps to beat Anderson's corps to the spot. For his part, Grant later insisted it would have been likely, writing, quote, "Wilson, who was ordered to seize the town, did so with his division of cavalry, but he could not hold it against the Confederate corps, which had not been detained at the crossing of the Po, as it would have been but for the unfortunate change in Merritt's orders. Had he been permitted to execute the orders Sheridan gave him, he would have been guarding with 2 brigades of cavalry the bridge over the Po River, which Anderson had to cross, and must have detained him long enough to enable Warren to reinforce Wilson and hold the town." End quote. As soon as the sun came up on May 8, the Union cavalry busied itself trying to break through the Confederate defenses on Brock Road just north of Spotsylvania. If Sheridan's cavalry could dislodge the Confederates there, it would prevent the rest of the Confederate army from being able to march northeast toward Spotsylvania along the old Courthouse Road, which would have required Lee's army to fall back several miles south to the next natural defensive line along the Po River. While Wesley Merritt's division skirmished with Fitzhugh Lee's Confederate cavalry on the Brock Road, Anderson's corps and Warren's corps marched toward the action, both intending to hold Brock Road for their respective armies. As Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry fought a delaying action around the Alsop farm, 2 brigades from Anderson's corps marched north to arrive at Laurel Hill, just south of the farm. As those men pulled into position on the ridge of Laurel Hill, they spotted men from Warren's V Corps just 100 yards away. Warren was operating under the assumption that the men he saw on Laurel Hill were just Confederate cavalry, unaware that an entire corps of Confederate infantry was in the vicinity. While Warren's men prepared for that assault, Joseph Kershaw's division of Anderson Corps was clearing away a brigade of Union cavalry south of Laurel Hill, ensuring that the rear was safe, and then allowing the rest of Anderson's corps to march up to the impromptu line at Laurel Hill. Perhaps due to his incorrect belief that he was only dealing with a small number of Confederate cavalry, Warren's initial attacks consisted of piecemeal maneuvers by separate divisions. As a result of Warren's inability to push Anderson's men at Laurel Hill, men from Ewell's corps were able to slide into the line to the right of Anderson before John Sedgwick's 6th Corps was in position on Warren's left. The 2 Union corps attempted a coordinated assault on the night of May 8, with Warren finally willing to put in all his men, but by then they were surprised to find Ewell's men in position, and the assault was quickly and sharply repulsed. May 8 had not been a good day for the Union. Delays in their marches and countermanded cavalry orders had let Anderson occupy the crossroads at Spotsylvania in force. Warren's inability to initially beat back 2 brigades on Laurel Hill allowed those defenders to allow 2 whole corps to take up positions there, and Sedgwick's inability to get up quickly enough prevented the Union from launching a decisive assault that night. The failures of May 8 had Meade in his notorious snapping turtle mode, with his short temper long gone by the end of the day. He was irate at Warren's caution, Sedgwick's slowness, and Sheridan's command of the cavalry, over which they had serious philosophical differences of opinion. Meade preferred having his cavalry perform traditional duties like screening army movements and reconnaissance, but Sheridan was a soldier who had previously commanded infantry and spoiled for a fight. Sheridan explained the roots of the friction between the 2 of them in his memoirs. Quote, "Before and at the review I took in this situation, and determined to remedy it if possible, so in due time I sought an interview with General Meade and informed him that, as the effectiveness of my command rested mainly on the strengths of its horses, I thought the duty it was then performing was both burdensome and wasteful. I also gave him my ideas as to what the cavalry should do, the main purport of which was that it ought to be kept concentrated to fight the enemy's cavalry." Heretofore, the commander of the cavalry corps had been virtually but an adjunct at army headquarters, a sort of chief of cavalry, and my proposition seemed to stagger General Meade not a little. I knew that it would be difficult to overcome the recognized custom of using the cavalry for the protection of trains and the establishment of cordons around the infantry corps, and so far subordinating its operations to the movements of the main army that in name only was it a corps at all, but still I thought it my duty to try. At first General Meade would hardly listen to my proposition, for he was filled with the prejudices that, from the beginning of the war, had pervaded the army regarding the importance and usefulness of cavalry. General Scott then predicting that the contest would be settled by artillery, and thereafter refusing the services of regiment after regiment of mounted troops, General Meade deemed cavalry fit for little more than guard and picket duty, and wanted to know what would protect the transportation trains and artillery reserve, cover the front of moving infantry columns, and secure his flanks from intrusion, if my policy were pursued. I told him that if he would let me use the cavalry as I contemplated, he need have little solicitude in these respects, for, with a mass of 10,000 mounted men, it was my belief that I could make 194 it so lively for the enemy's cavalry that, so far as attacks from it were concerned, the flanks and rear of the Army of the Potomac would require little or no defense, and claimed further that moving columns of infantry should take care of their own fronts. I also told him that it was my object to defeat the enemy's cavalry in a general combat, if possible, and by such a result establish a feeling of confidence in my own troops that would enable us after a while to march where we pleased, for the purpose of breaking General Lee's communications and destroying the resources from which his army was supplied. The idea, as here outlined, was contrary to Meade's convictions, for though at different times since he commanded the Army of the Potomac, considerable bodies of the cavalry had been massed for some special occasion, yet he had never agreed to the plan as a permanency, and could not be bent to it now. He gave little encouragement, therefore, to what I proposed, yet the conversation was immediately beneficial in one way, for when I laid before him the true condition of the cavalry, he promptly relieved it from much of the arduous and harassing picket service it was performing, thus giving me about 2 weeks in which to nurse the horses before the campaign opened. The interview also disclosed the fact that the cavalry commander should be, according to General Meade's views, at his headquarters practically as one of his staff, although whom he would give detailed directions, as in his judgment occasionally required. Meade's ideas and mine being so widely divergent, disagreements arose between us later during the battles of the Wilderness, which lack of concord ended in some concessions on his part after the movement toward Spotsylvania Court House began, and although I doubt that his convictions were ever wholly changed, yet from that date on, in the organization of the Army of the Potomac, the Cavalry Corps became more of a compact body, with the same privileges and responsibilities that attached to the other corps conditions that never actually existed before. End quote. On the night of May 8th, Meade and Sheridan continued arguing over the use of cavalry, and during the debate, Sheridan suggested that his cavalry be massed and allowed to find and engage J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry. While Meade was against it, Grant held his former Western subordinate in higher regard, and acceded to Sheridan's request, stating, quote, "Well, he generally knows what he is talking about. Let him start right out and do it." End quote. As a result, Sheridan's entire force of 10,000 cavalry left the Army of the Potomac, and would end up missing the most important fighting of the battle at Spotsylvania. For example, once it was apparent that it was safe to do so, Lee began pulling his army out of their defensive lines at Spotsylvania on the night of May 21st, and began marching them south toward the North River Anna. As it turned out, Ewell's Corps and Anderson's Corps were in some places less than a mile west of the Union 5 Corps as they made their night march south towards the river. Had the Union cavalry been in position in advance of the Union Army, Warren's Corps may have delayed 2 of Lee's corps, or at least inflicted some damage on them while they were in marching formation. But Sheridan had instead used his entire cavalry force for raids and to attack Stuart's cavalry. As a result, the Union cavalry were away on a raid that night, leading one Northern officer to gripe, quote, "Never was the want of cavalry more painfully felt." End quote. Sheridan would go on to call the raiding around Richmond a success, but most modern historians have since sided with Meade's side of the argument, with Overland Campaign historian Gordon Rhea going so far as to write, quote, "In the larger picture, Sheridan's raid proved to be a costly mistake. Chasing Stuart was another sideshow for the campaign, which would be decided by what the armies did at Spotsylvania. By abandoning the main theater of conflict to pursue his whimsical raid south, Sheridan deprived Grant of an important resource. His victory at Yellow Tavern offered scant solace to the blue-clad soldiers hunkered in trenches above the courthouse town. Sheridan's absence hurt Grant at Spotsylvania in much the same way that Stuart's absence from Gettysburg had handicapped Lee." End quote. Chapter 5. Racing to Yellow Tavern. Having been given the necessary discretion by Grant, Sheridan immediately organized a raid against Confederate supply and railroad lines close to Richmond, knowing it would force Stuart to confront him. Leaving just one regiment behind for routine patrol, about 1,000 men, Sheridan set out with about 13,000 mounted soldiers organized into columns stretching 13 miles. On May 9th, the largest cavalry force ever seen in the Eastern Theater, along with 32 artillery pieces, arched southeast, intending to slip behind Lee's army with 3 goals: to disrupt Lee's supply lines by destroying railroad tracks and supplies, to threaten the Confederate capital of Richmond, and most significantly for Sheridan, to take Stuart out of the war. As luck would have it, Sheridan and his men only required a few days to make the Stuart problem go away once and for all. Moving aggressively to the southeast, Sheridan crossed the North Anna River and seized Beaver Dam Station on the Virginia Central Railroad, then circled wide around Lee's right, so wide that he had Lee virtually encircled before he was detected. He noted in his memoirs, quote, "As soon as the Nye, Po, and Ta rivers were crossed, each of which streams would have afforded an excellent defensive line to the enemy, all anxiety as to our passing around Lee's army was removed, and our ability to cross the North Anna placed beyond doubt. Meanwhile, General Stuart had discovered what we were about, and he set his cavalry in motion, sending General Fitzhugh Lee to follow and attack my rear on the Childsburg Road, Stuart himself marching by way of Davenport's Bridge on the North Anna toward Beaver Dam Station, near which place his whole command was directed to unite the next day. Quote, my column having passed the Ta River, Stuart attacked its rear with considerable vigor, in the hope that he could delay my whole force long enough to permit him to get at least a part of his command in my front. But this scheme was frustrated by Davies' brigade, which I directed to fight as a rear guard, holding on at one position and then at another along the line of march just enough to deter the enemy from a too rapid advance. Davies performed this responsible and trying duty with tact and good judgment, following the main column steadily as it progressed to the south, and never once permitting Fitzhugh Lee's advance to encroach far enough to compel a halt of my main body. About dark, Merritt's division crossed the North Anna at Anderson's Ford, while Gregg and Wilson encamped on the north side, having engaged the enemy, who still hung on my rear up to a late hour at night. Stuart was nipping at Sheridan's heels with about 3,000 cavalry of his own, but he desperately wanted to interpose himself between Sheridan and Richmond. Sheridan explained, quote, Stuart had hardly united his troops near Beaver Dam when he realized that concentrating there was a mistake, so he began making dispositions for remedying his error, and while we leisurely took the Negro Foot Road towards Richmond, he changed his tactics and hauled off from my rear, urging his horses to the death in order to get in between Richmond and my column. This he effected about 10 o'clock on the morning of the 11th, concentrating at Yellow Tavern, 6 miles from the city on the Brook Turnpike. His change of tactics left my march on the 10th practically unmolested, and we quietly encamped that night on the south bank of the South Anna, near Ground Squirrel Bridge. Here we procured an abundance of forage, and as the distance traveled that day had been only 15 to 18 miles, men and horses were able to obtain a good rest during the night. End quote. As a result, Sheridan and his cavalry spent May 10th cutting railroads and hampering the Confederate supply lines as they headed toward Yellow Tavern. More importantly, while Stuart intended to keep Sheridan away from Richmond, he was unsure of what route the Union forces would take, which required keeping at least some contact with them. In fact, the two cavalry forces were so close to Richmond that some Union cavalry were nearly tricked into marching right into the Confederate capital. In his work about Stuart, Charles H. L. Johnston, who rode with Stuart's cavalry, quoted a Union cavalryman. Quote, we marched all night, and the halts were frequent and exasperating. It was so dark that we could only follow the cavalry by putting a bugler on a white horse directly in the rear of the regiment in front of us, with orders to move on as soon as they did. Finally, whether the bugler fell asleep while waiting, or we fell asleep while watching the white horse, it happened that we found a gap of unknown dimensions in front of us, and started to trot in order to close it up. It was a swampy region. The hoofs and wheels made little or no sound. Once the blackness was pierced with a jet of vivid flame, and a sharp explosion on the road showed that we had sprung one of the torpedoes which had been some time planted there. While in doubt of the direction of the highway, we came upon a man wrapped in a blue overcoat, standing near a gate, who told us that General Sheridan had left him to show us the way. Of course we followed his direction and entered the gate. It was evident that we were very near the city, as we could see the lights and hear the dogs barking. The road became less plainly marked and led into extensive pleasure grounds, and finally we brought up on the edge of a large fish pond. At that moment, half a dozen flashes came from what seemed to be an embankment, and we found that we were in a veritable trap, and immediately under the fire of one of the outworks of the city. The guide who had given us the direction was either a deserter or a rebel in our uniform, and had deliberately misled us. He received the reward of his treachery, for Colonel McIntosh, who had, from the first, suspected him, kept near him, and when their guns opened on our advance, blew out his brains." Heros von Borch, who was a member of Stuart's cavalry until being seriously wounded at Gettysburg, was in Richmond on the 11th and described the state of affairs in the city. Quote, "On the morning of the 11th, May, 1864, Richmond was thrown once more into a state of excitement by the rapid advance against it of the Federal cavalry under General Sheridan, who had managed to march round our lines. Several brigades of infantry hastened from the south side of the James River to the defense of the city. The militia were called out, and all expected that the outer lines of fortifications would every moment become the scene of a serious combat. Everything continued quiet, however, in that direction, until about 11 o'clock, when a sudden cannonade sounded in the rear of the enemy, the indefatigable Stuart having followed in their track, and with the small force, which was all he had been able, owing to the rapid marching, to take with him, being now enabled to cut off the Federal line of retreat. The sound of our light guns, which I recognized so well, did not fail to rouse me into a state of excitement, and as an old war-horse prances and curvets at the shrill ringing of the trumpet, I felt the blood pour like electric fire through my veins, and rushed about in feverish uneasiness." Von Borch would borrow a horse and try to race in vain to Stuart's side at Yellow Tavern that morning. Quote, "As the hostile force lay immediately between ours, it was not easy to get this information. But a road was pointed out to me with such assurance that it would take me to General Stuart without bringing me into collision with the Yankees, that I galloped along it with very little precaution, and had just crossed over a bridge, when, from the woods on the right and left, a scattered band of Federal cavalry bore down upon me with loud shouts, firing their revolvers at me, and demanding my surrender. I immediately turned my pony's head round, and galloped off to the rear with all the speed I could, and an exciting chase now ensued for several miles, till I was put a stop to by the fire of our pickets, whom I reached completely exhausted and thoroughly surprised at my narrow escape. It was sufficiently evident, by the sound of the firing, that Stuart was hardly pressed, and I hastened at once to General Bragg, commanding our infantry, which, from a succession of reinforcements, was now of considerable strength, begging him at once to advance several brigades to the assistance of Stuart. The cautiousness characteristic of that general, however, induced him to resist my appeals, and finding further effort useless, I slowly retraced my steps to Richmond." End quote. Meanwhile, Sheridan described the operations that were already in progress. Quote, "At 2 o'clock in the morning, May 11, Davies' brigade of Gregg's division marched for Ashland to cut the Fredericksburg Railroad. Arriving there before the head of the enemy's column, which had to pass through the same place to reach Yellow Tavern, Davies drove out a small force occupying the town, burnt a train of cars and a locomotive, destroyed the railroad for some distance, and rejoined the main column at Allen Station on the Fredericksburg and Richmond Railroad. From Allen Station the whole command moved on Yellow Tavern, Merritt in the lead, Wilson following, and Gregg in the rear. The appearance of Davies' brigade at Ashland in the morning had had the effect of further mystifying the enemy as to my intentions, and while he held it incumbent to place himself between me and Richmond, yet he was still so uncertain of my movements that he committed the same fault that he did the first day, when he divided his force and sent a part to follow me on the Childsburg road. He now divided his command again, sending a portion to hang upon my rear, while he proceeded with the rest to Yellow Tavern. This separation not only materially weakened the force which might have been thrown across my line of march, but it also enabled me to attack with almost my entire corps while occupying the pursuers with a small rear guard." End quote. These dispositions meant that when the Union vanguard reached Stuart's front at Yellow Tavern later on the 11th, Stuart's forces would be divided, and by pushing the cavalry so strenuously to Yellow Tavern, both the men and horses would be exhausted. The stage was set for a scene of chaos that would bring about one of the most important deaths of the Civil War. Chapter 6. The Battle of Yellow Tavern. The Confederates had pushed their horses as hard as possible to reach Yellow Tavern, but they only beat the advancing Union cavalry by about an hour. That left them little time to form a line along the Ashland and Richmond road. When Merritt's division in the vanguard of the Union cavalry came into view of Stuart's cavalry, he immediately exhorted his men to attack. Sheridan described the scene. Quote, "By forced marches, General Stuart succeeded in reaching Yellow Tavern ahead of me on May 11th, and the presence of his troops on the Ashland and Richland road becoming known to Merritt as he was approaching the Brook Turnpike, this general pressed forward at once to the attack. Pushing his division to the front, he soon got possession of the turnpike and drove the enemy back several hundred yards to the east of it. This success had the effect of throwing the head of my column to the east of the pike, and I quickly brought up Wilson as one of Gregg's brigades to take advantage of the situation by forming a line of battle on that side of the road. Meanwhile, the enemy, desperate but still confident, poured in a heavy fire from his line and from a battery which enfiladed the Brook Road, and made Yellow Tavern an uncomfortably hot place. Gibbs and Devon's brigades, however, held fast there." End quote. Custer was renowned for his aggressive nature, and while it would get him into trouble over a decade later at Little Bighorn, he was admired among his superiors. Sheridan described the charge made by Custer's brigade at Yellow Tavern. Quote, "Custer's charge, with Chapman on his flank and the rest of Wilson's division sustaining him, was brilliantly executed. Beginning at a walk, he increased his gait to a trot, and then at full speed rushed the enemy. At the same moment the dismounted troops along my whole front moved forward, and as Custer went through the battery, capturing 2 of the guns with their cannoneers, and breaking up the enemy's left, Gibbs and Devon drove his center and right from the field. Gregg, meanwhile, with equal success, charged the force in his rear Gordon's brigade, and the engagement ended by giving us complete control of the road to Richmond. We captured a number of prisoners, and the casualties on both sides were quite severe." End quote. Custer's brigade was pushing Lomax's Confederate brigade steadily back, which compelled Stuart to not only order a countercharge, but enter the fray himself. The 1st Virginia Cavalry was used to drive back the Michiganders, while Stuart was in the thick of the action trying to rally his men and firing his pistols at the charging Union cavalry as they rode past his position. Eventually, the 1st Virginia forced the Michiganders to begin retreating, which brought some of them back towards where Stuart was positioned. John A. Huff, who had been a Union sharpshooter for years and was a member of the 5th Michigan, was heading to the rear when he caught sight of the Confederate cavalry leader's impeccable uniform. He fired his pistol at Stuart from about 20 yards away, and the shot tore through Stuart, who fell forward on his horse and had his plumed hat fall to the ground. When one of his staff members noticed Stuart was injured, he asked the chieftain if he had been shot, to which Stuart replied, "I'm afraid I am." One Confederate soldier later provided an account of Stuart's wounding that was reproduced in the very popular Battles and Leaders series. Quote, "On the morning of the fight at Yellow Tavern, I was acting as one of Stuart's couriers. At the beginning of it, I was stationed in front of the tavern, under one of a row of trees that lined the way close by. To my left, about 400 yards off, the enemy could be easily seen emerging from a piece of woods and forming for battle. A short distance to my right, I saw an irregular line of Confederates. Pretty soon from the enemy came lively volleys whistling through the trees and starting the dust in the road. In a few minutes I saw 2 horsemen approach from the Confederate side. As they drew near, I recognized General Stuart and Colonel Walter Houlihan. They halted nearby in the road, and Stuart, taking out his field glass, deliberately watched the maneuvers of the enemy, though balls were whizzing past him. Presently, regardless of the increasing fire, which was now accompanied with shouts, Stuart put his glass away, and taking out paper and pencil, wrote an order. Handing it to Colonel Houlihan, he told him to take it to General Lomax. That officer replied by pointing to me and suggesting that I should carry it. Stuart assented, and I rode off in search of General Lomax. The firing continued to increase, and many squadrons were in sight. The enemy, awake to their superior numbers, seemed about to make a general advance, while our men were availing themselves of the character of the ground to repel their attack. After going a few rods to the rear, my horse, excited by the firing, suddenly stopped and refused to budge. After several vain attempts with the spur and the fiat side of my sword to start him, I at last struck him with all my strength right between the ears. This downed him, but he soon rose and ran off at the top of his speed. I soon came to where General Lomax was, and coming into collision with his horse, gained his immediate attention. After reading the note, he told me to go back and tell General Stuart that the order had been delivered. Quote, In a few moments I rejoined him sitting on his horse, close behind a line of dismounted men who were firing at the advancing Federals. The disparity of numbers between the opposing forces was very great, to judge from appearances. Our men seemed aware of their inferior strength, but were not dismayed. The enemy confidently pressed forward with exultant shouts, delivering tremendous volleys. The Confederates returned their fire with yells of defiance. Stuart, with pistol in hand, shot over the heads of the troops, while with words of cheer he encouraged them. He kept saying, "Steady, men, steady, give it to them." Presently he reeled in his saddle. His head was bowed and his hat fell off. He turned and said as I drew nearer, "Go and tell General Lee and Dr. Fontaine to come here." I wheeled at once and went as fast as I could to do his bidding. Coming to the part of the line where General Lomax was, I told him Stuart was hurt and that he wanted General Fitz Lee. He pointed to the left and told me to hurry. Soon I found General Lee and delivered the message. He was riding a light gray, if I remember, and instantly upon receipt of the news went like an arrow down the line. When I returned, Stuart had been taken from his horse and was being carried by his men off the field. I saw him put in an ambulance, and I followed it close behind. He lay without speaking as it went along, but kept shaking his head with an expression of the deepest disappointment. End quote. As was often the case, Stuart and those closest to him tried to keep the extent of his injury secret from his cavalry, for fear that the spread of such knowledge would demoralize the men. Fitz Lee took over for Stuart, who had commanded his men to keep driving the enemy back, but as news spread that he was injured, his men began to panic. As Stuart noticed some of his men retreating in a disorganized fashion, he pleaded from the ambulance, go back, and do your duty as I've done mine, and our country will be safe. Go back, I'd rather die than be whipped." The fighting lasted about an hour after Stuart's injury, and ended with the Confederates pushing back, and thus conceding the road to Richmond to Sheridan. The losses on each side were not clear in the wake of the battle. Sheridan was confident that he could have actually taken Richmond if he wanted, but that it wouldn't be feasible because he couldn't hold it. He was later quoted as saying, "Do you know that we have only a lot of department clerks from Richmond in front of us who have been forced into the ranks? I could capture Richmond if I wanted to, but I can't hold it, and the prisoners tell me that every house in the suburbs is loopholed and the streets barricaded. It isn't worth the men it would cost, but I'll stay here all day to show these fellows how much I care for them, and go when I get ready." Chapter 7. The Death of Stuart. While the Confederates were in the process of leaving the field, Stuart's ambulance took a circuitous route to Richmond to avoid being intercepted by Sheridan's cavalry, which only exacerbated the wounded leader's condition. One of Stuart's aides, Lieutenant Walter Houlihan, happened to be a doctor, so he assessed the wound in the ambulance. At this point Stuart was still playful, asking Houlihan, quote, "Honey bun, how do I look in the face?" End quote. Although the doctor tried to reassure him, Stuart replied, quote, "Well, I don't know how this will turn out, but if it is God's will that I shall die, I am ready." End quote. Stuart was transported back to his brother-in-law's house in Richmond, from where he could actually hear his cavalry continuing to skirmish with Sheridan, and von Bork met with him while he was still lucid. Quote, "I was awakened suddenly about daybreak on the 12th by the voice of Dr. Brewer, Stuart's brother-in-law, who informed me that my general had been wounded severely, and carried during the night to his place, where he was anxious to see me. Forgetting my own condition at these sad tidings, I dressed myself in a few minutes, and hastened to the bedside of my dear friend, whom I found in a small room of the doctor's house, surrounded by most of the members of his staff. He received me with a smile, saying, "I'm glad you've come, my dear Vaughan. You see they've got me at last, but don't feel uneasy. I don't think I'm so badly wounded as you were, and I hope I shall get over it as you did." End quote. Stuart was also able to detail the Battle of Yellow Tavern to von Bork, at least from his own perspective. Quote, "He then recounted to me all the incidents of the combat, and the manner in which he had been wounded. Hoping every hour to hear of General Bragg's attack, which in all probability would have resulted in the annihilation of the whole force of the enemy, he had successfully resisted their efforts to break through his lines, and for more than 6 hours had fought with 1,100 men against 8,000. At about 4 o'clock, the Federals succeeded by a general charge in breaking and driving back one of our regiments, which General Stuart was rallying in an open field. When continuing their advance, the enemy were met by 1st Virginia and driven back again in confusion. Seeing near him some of the dismounted Federal cavalry, who were running off on the opposite side of a high fence, Stuart rode up to them, calling on them to surrender, and firing at them as they continued their flight. He had just discharged the last barrel of his revolver when the hindmost of the fugitives, coming close up to the fence, fired his revolver at him, the ball taking effect in the lower part of the stomach and traversing the whole body. Stuart, finding himself severely wounded, and the enemy at the same time renewing their attack, turned his charger quickly round and galloped 1/2 a mile further to the rear, where he was taken from his horse, nearly insensible from loss of blood, and sent in an ambulance to Richmond. End quote. President Jefferson Davis then showed up to visit Stuart, whose condition was about to take a turn for the worse. Von Bork recalled, quote, "During the early part of the morning the general felt comparatively easy, and the physician entertained great hope that the wound might not prove fatal. Towards noon, however, a change took place for the worse, and our fears began to be greatly excited. About this time President Davis visited the prostrate hero. Taking his hand, the President said, 'General, how do you feel?' He replied, 'Easy, but willing to die if God and my country think I have fulfilled my destiny and done my duty.'" End quote. By the middle of the afternoon, the doctor informed Stuart that he was unlikely to survive the night, to which Stuart stoically replied, quote, "I am resigned if it be God's will, but I would like to see my wife, but God's will be done." End quote. Von Bork described the scene. Quote, "He then made his last dispositions and took leave of us all, I being the last. I had been sitting on his bed, holding his hand in mine, and handing him the ice, which he ate in great abundance, and which was applied to his burning hot wounds to cool them. Drawing me towards him, and grasping my hand firmly, he said, 'My dear Vaughan, I am sinking fast now, but before I die I want you to know that I never loved a man as much as yourself. I pray your life may be long and happy, look after my family after I'm gone, and be the same true friend to my wife and children that you have been to me.' These were the last connected words he spoke. During the next few hours the paroxysms of pain became more frequent and violent." End quote. Unfortunately for Stuart and his wife Flora, Sheridan's cavalry had done a good enough job tearing up railroads that she was delayed in reaching him, and as night came on, Stuart became delirious, talking incoherently about past battlefields and his family. Around 7 p.m. he said his last words, quote, "I am going fast now. I am resigned. God's will be done." End quote. The 31-year-old was dead within the hour, shortly before Flora reached her brother's house. Von Bork explained, quote, "Poor Mrs. Stuart arrived an hour after the general's death. Of all the messages sent to her, my telegram alone had reached, but the operator hearing, after I had left the office, that Stuart was getting better, altered the words, 'The general is dangerously wounded,' and substituted 'slightly wounded.' The poor lady arrived at Dr. Brewer's house unaware of her husband's death, and when on asking if she could see the general and receiving an affirmative answer, she rushed upstairs, expecting to find him alive. It was only in the most cruel manner, by the spectacle of her husband's cold, pale brow, that she learned the terrible misfortune which had befallen her and her children." End quote. Needless to say, Stuart's death demoralized the South as a whole. Confederate veteran John Eston Cook, who wrote several books about the war, including a biography of Lee, wrote, quote, "His fall was a grievous blow to General Lee's heart, as well as to the Southern cause. Endowed by nature with a courage which shrunk from nothing, active, energetic, of immense physical stamina, which enabled him to endure any amount of fatigue, devoted heart and soul to the cause in which he fought, and looking up to the commander of the army with childlike love and admiration, Stuart could be ill spared at this critical moment, and General Lee was plunged into the deepest melancholy at the intelligence of his death. When it reached him, he retired from those around him, and remained for some time communing with his own heart and memory. When one of his staff entered and spoke of Stuart, General Lee said, in a low voice, "I can scarcely think of him without weeping." Lee also remarked, "Stuart had never brought me a piece of false information." In addition to morale, there was also the matter of competently replacing Stuart. In this regard, the Confederates were fortunate enough to be able to have command devolve on Wade Hampton III, one of the Civil War's finest cavalry officers. Still, Cook conceded that there was an inevitable decline in the quality of the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry. Quote, "The command of the cavalry devolved upon General Hampton, and it was fought throughout the succeeding campaign with the nerve and efficiency of a great soldier. But Stuart had, as it were, formed and molded it with his own hands. He was the first great commander of horse in the war, and it was hard for successors, however great their genius, to compete with his memory." End quote. On May 20th, Lee formally announced the cavalry leader's death to the Army of Northern Virginia. Quote, "Among the gallant soldiers who have fallen in this war, General Stuart was second to none in valor, in zeal, and in unfaltering devotion to his country. To military capacity of a high order and all the nobler virtues of the soldier he added the brighter graces of a pure life, guided and sustained by the Christian's faith and hope. The mysterious hand of an all-wise God has removed him from the scene of his usefulness and fame. His grateful countrymen will mourn his loss and cherish his memory. To his comrades in arms he has left the proud recollection of his deeds and his inspiring influence of his example." End quote. This has been the Battle of Yellow Tavern, the history of the Civil War battle that ended J.E.B. Stuart's life. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Michael Gilboe. Copyright 2012 by Charles River Editors. Production copyright 2015 by Charles River Editors.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.